Okay, Shalom Aleichem Rabotai. Very glad to be here and to share Torah with everyone over here. Great in a community, special community, especially of the Yotzei Paras. And there's also a very strong element of Yotzei Mashhad, which are built on Mesirut Nefesh. And that's really one of the messages that I wanted to share with you today about the tremendous Mesirut Nefesh. So before I start on the actual shi'ur and presenting the minhagim, I want to give you a little bit of background. Rabbi Javahari already started mentioning some of the details, and I want to expand on that. So, I grew up in a very prominent Moroccan kahila, where the people who came from Morocco basically replicated those communities that they had there in the shores of North America. And when I went to yeshivot and I grew in my own path in Torah, so I heard different voices from different people from within the community, from outside the community, saying, what you're doing is not correct. You know, in the halachah it says this opinion, it's good to be machmir like this opinion, or you're absolutely, what you're doing is a bracha levatala, and others would tell me what you're doing is absolutely wrong. And I was shocked, obviously, and I also took what they said to heart, and I said they're probably right, because they probably learned in yeshivot and more than I did, and they're probably right. And it always stayed with me. I kept it in my mind. And as I learned in other yeshivot in Eretz Yisrael, I saw the similar thing. People were not as exposed to their minhagim over there as much. It's just a big melting pot in Eretz Yisrael, and there was a lot of confusion. And I wasn't confused. I knew what we used to do in the home, but people were telling me what I did in the home wasn't right. So as I embarked on the journey of investigating the topic of minhagim, and I'll explain to you what the word minhag means. It's very vague minyan, and it can be interpreted in many different ways. I discovered that the questions that they were asking on all of these topics were actually based on very, very strong sources from the Bet Yosef, from the Shulchan Aruch, and from minhagei Yisrael, of many communities in minhagei Yisrael, and were circumventing many halachic issues. And that's when I became closer to the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim at the time, Rabbi Shalom Meshash, who was previously the chief rabbi of Morocco. I had the zechut of being close to Rabbi Yashiv as well. I also had the zechut of being close to Rav Ovadia Yosef. I lived right next to him for many, many years. And I started learning from these great people and these great geonim about the world of halacha. And I discovered that the world of minhag and the world of halacha is very, very interesting. It's very strong sources. And it's just a matter of lack of education that people have. That's all. There are certain machlokets that there is going to be, but I would say 80 to 90% of it is just a lack of basic knowledge and basic education. So as Rabbi Javahari said, I embarked on this journey, and I wrote Sfarim. And as I was fully involved in this subject, I moved to Tehran, or Los Angeles, whatever you want to call it. And I moved to a place called Westwood. You ever heard of Westwood? It wasn't the bastion of Torah, but we had a kollel there. We had a kollel, the Link kollel, based out of a place called Westwood Kehila. And there, it was an Ashkenazi kollel, but I had that at the same time a Sephardic minyan that they asked me to head. And it was 99% Persian and 1% Moroccan. I was that 1%. But it was actually a breath of fresh air, because it was like such wonderful people, and and they were so welcoming, and I was introduced to their minhagim, which aroused a lot of curiosity by me. I knew, as I was telling Rabbi Javari, I knew some of my old students in Yerushalayim were actually from Great Neck, New Jersey, so I knew a little bit about the Persian customs. As a matter of fact, 2 months before I left, they sat me down and they said, Rabbi Lebhar, if you're going to Los Angeles, we're going to teach you Persian vocabulary. So they taught me 20, 30, 40 keywords, and those words stay with me till today. That I don't get ripped off at the market, and that I did other things. I make sure that I use those words well, and I expanded my vocabulary ever since then. So I'm really an honorary Persian. That's number one. What happened was, at the time, since I had more of a scope of knowledge of what the kihilot do, so I noticed many of the customs, many of the minhagim, and it was interesting to me. And I spoke to them like, who are the rabbanim of the community, and who are the sfarim that people base themselves on. I got a lot of like blank stares, not from that community, from the rabbanim of the community. They were like, nothing really, and we don't really know, we don't really follow. That was the past, and that bothered me tremendously, hearing that. Not only that, some people were telling me even things that were even worse, that really the whole rabbinic system that was there wasn't really based on anything. You can't rely on anything, and that was actually hurtful to me to hear that, because I looked at a community of tens of thousands of people who are Yirei Shamayim, and people who are dedicated to Torah, and to just say that beforehand was nothing was something that was very difficult for me. So at that time, one of the people in my community handed me a notebook of the writings of his grandfather, that he was the Av Bedin of Hamadan. He was the Av Bedin of Hamadan. And I had one of the Rabbanim of the Kollel at the time. His name is Harav Ariel Ovadia. He's an important Rav in Lakewood now. He transcribed it, and he worked on the document. His brother also worked on the footnotes of the document about the different she'elot teshuvot and the questions and answers that were at the time in Hamadan and in Tehran, because there was interaction between the different communities. And there was a Bet Din system. Definitely it wasn't comparable to the bastion of Torah in Iraq at the time, or maybe in Turkey or in other places, but there was definitely a system of Bet Din. There were definitely Talmidei Chachamim there, and there was definitely Torah that was kept throughout the generations. And I told myself this would be something important, because to my knowledge there wasn't one halachic sefer written in Iran of She'elot Teshuvot that was published, at least that I knew of. And it was kind of shelved on the time, because I had many other projects I was working on. I was busy with the kollel. And only when I came, I left to Toronto at the time, I came back, it was only 15 years later that the project came back to life, because as I was back in LA and I saw already that there's more and more B'nai Torah, and they're asking, what are our minhagim? What are our customs? What are our traditions based on? And I thought that it would be important for them to see that they had a strong Misorah, Rabbanim, as well as minhagim. So, together with a group of very fine individuals, one in particular, the one who gave me the notebook, his name is Sharam Zamanzadeh, I want to mention him, as well as somebody else that was very, very involved in the Sefer. His name is Avishai Shraga, from the Shraga dynasty of Yazd, and he really researched a lot of the history of the different Chachamim that there were at the time. He has a wonderful presentation. Next time, if you could get him to Great Neck to give that presentation, he has a whole slideshow that he could show you the different Rabbanim at the time and the different challenges and persecutions. It's a great thing. Otherwise, it's available online. Rabbi Javahar, you'll be able to send it out to you. And he helped a lot with this section. So when we were zoche to put up the Sefer, when did we put up the Sefer? About less than a year ago? Something like the Persian Sefer? 5 months ago. Thank you. Now you know where my head is. 5 months ago, there was a tremendous simcha in the community that people finally said, here, we have our chachamim and the bachurei yeshiva connected to the past and say, here we come from a legacy. There were reasons why the community, the Persian community, wasn't able to develop to their fullest in the great yeshivot as in other places, and that's spoken about in the Sefer, but the different reasons why. And that's not the topic of our shiur, but the definitely the mesirut nefesh of the Persian community, and the fact that it is the oldest community that didn't have any interruption throughout the generations, the oldest community from the time of Mamash, the Geonim, when the Gemara was written, till they always had communities there. Nachon, there was a lot of persecution, but they all had communities that gave a tremendous perspective on the depth and on the traditions and on the solidity and the foundation of the Torah of the community. So, and this Sefer has really three sections. It has the historical section, it has the questions and answers of Betin from Rav David Sasson, Chacham David Sasson from Hamedan, of Bedin of Hamedan, and it has a section of minhagim, where two Talmidei Chachamim in Eretz, who were originally from Los Angeles, and now are in Eretz Yisrael, wrote, Rav Yitzchakian and Rav Balanes. They both worked on this subject because the topic of minhagim is a tricky one, and that's going to be my subject today. And they wrote exactly they started it. There's a much larger work that is there are people working on regarding Torat Minhagim of Paras. We have a Rav in our kollel. His name is Rabbi Yisraeli. He's working very, very hard on this subject as well. We hope it comes out soon. So there's a lot of work in this regard that's B'ezrat Hashem going to come out in the future. So I'm going to give you now that I gave you a little bit of an introduction, where I'm coming from, where I landed from. I'm going to give you a little bit of a perspective of what this Torat HaMinhagim is, and a few snippets of Minhagei Paras. I have to give a lot of Akarat Tov to Rabbi Bin Simchon and from the yeshiva of Great Neck over here, Bet Midrash of Great Neck, that had this initiative of bringing us to Great Neck. It's hard for me to leave Los Angeles. Usually I don't get that opportunity, and they kept on insisting, and Baruch Hashem, I'm glad to be here. So I'm going to be giving like a part 2 of that shiur after I finish over here. I'm going to be giving a part 2 of the shiur over there. Anybody wants to continue hearing on the dynamics of kehilot in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz, why should keep their minhagim? Should they keep their minhagim at all? And different minhagim and different examples of those minhagim, particularly of Paras. But today's shiur, I'm going to focus more on what is a minhag and should a minhag be kept. It's a very large subject, but I'm just going to give you the Rashi Prakim. When we speak about minhag, and when it comes up in the Lashon HaPoskim, it comes in Lashon HaGemara, it could be categorized in three different categories. The first category is there are minhagi isur. If a community, and the Gemara in Masechet Psachim, Perek Daled, speaks about if a community accepted upon themselves a certain stringency, like the Gemara was talking about not doing melacha on Erev Pesach, before Chatzot even, and when a community accepts upon themselves certain minhagim, so that becomes binding even for their children. A perfect example of this is kitniyot. The Ashkenazi community accepted upon themselves kitniyot, so a descendant from the Ashkenazim doesn't have the right to say, well, I'm not going to keep kitniyot. Since his kehila followed the minhag of kitniyot, and they decided that was their custom, so him as a child and a grandchild is obligated, whether the dynamics is because it's a neder, whether it's a dynamics because it's a kehila takana, it's another subject. But the crux of the issue is that a community has the right to accept upon themselves certain gdarim and certain minhagim, and there are certain minhagim that are spoken about in the Sefer. For example, the Chachmei Paras The Kehilot Paras were machmir on using glass on Pesach. They were machmir on not buying things during Sfirat HaOmer, much more than other communities. They were like in LA. I knew I got a few questions. One of them always about Ta'anid Bechorot. Always about Ta'anid Bechorot. Another one is whether they could buy a CD player at the time during the Sfirat HaOmer. But driving on Shabbat to your family, no, I didn't get that. That's what I said. I was at a Bet Knesset this Shabbat in Montreal, and the Rav got up and he said, Rabotai, the minhag of the community is not to speak during Kriyat Torah. It's a nice minhag, right? Right, Rabbi Javahari? I wish it was a minhag not to drive on Shabbat. Maybe, it happens to be one of the 10 commandments. But if it was a minhag, maybe it would be stronger. So there are certain things that the community accept upon themselves as a chumrah. You can't just say, well, I'll just be more lenient on it. If it's a minhag of a kehillah. Now, how to determine if it's a minhag kehillah or not is more tricky. But that's one topic, the minhag kehillah. Then the other concept, the second category of minhag, is hech nahagu ha'am, which is basically how we decide halachah. Halachah is a very confusing subject. You could have 15 different opinions. In the Shulchan Aruch, he'll bring yesh omrim, ve'yesh omrim, yesh omrim, ve'yesh cholkim. And even though we know that there are rules, yesh omrim, ve'yesh omrim, the halach is like the second yesh omrim, stam ve'yesh omrim, the halach is like the stam. Sometimes as we go follow the yesh omrim, we're machmir. Some say yes, some say more machmir. It's very confusing. So you'll notice the poskim evoke very often the language of kach nahagu ha'olam. The reason we'll follow this opinion because shekach nahagu. In the Kollel, we're learning now a very complicated subject. If a safek safeka could extract mammon, and the Pnei Yeshua says the Chachmei Sfaradim, they understood that a safek safeka could extract mammon. And I don't know how to go against them. They are such great gdolim, and I'm nothing compared to them, but I'm going to try anyways. And then the Knesset HaGdola, one of the great Sephardic Acharonim, Rabbi Tzina Bashol brings this down in the new volume, Yorodea Chelek He, in the Mavo, Anaf Yud Tet Zayin, writes, the Knesset HaGdola writes that Sfek Sfeka is not Motzi Mammon, Veken Aminaga Pashut. And this is the custom. In other words, a big machloket. What do? The Knesset HaGdola tells us, you know what we do? The custom was that we don't. And why do we care what the custom was? How did the custom evolve? The custom means that Rabbanim, hundreds, maybe thousands of Rabbanim, always leaned toward a certain side that gives halachic validity, and it gives strength to that custom, that this is how, in our generation, we should be posek halacha. It's off subject, but I have to mention that Rav Ben Tzina Bashol uses this klal to discuss the sfek sveka about heter mechira. Nowadays in Eretz Yisrael, I was in Eretz Yisrael, I saw a lot of fields. They wrote kan shomrim shmita, and they didn't rely on selling the field to a goy. Rav Avad Yosef has one of his heterim. Why one is allowed to do a heter mechira is because you have a safek sefeka. Safek, in other words, safek. Why should the mechira help? There's an essential problem. You're not allowed to sell land to a goy. It's called lo tehanem. In Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to sell land to a goy. And if you sell it, en shaliach lidvar avera, you can't have a messenger to do an avera. So here you're sending somebody to sell the land. The sale is not effective because it's an avera to sell the land. So Rav Yosef says, I have a safek sefika to allow it. So, safek, maybe b'di'avad, even in shliach l'dvar avera b'di'avad it works. And even if you want to say that b'di'avad it doesn't work, but maybe shogeg, there are opinions that if one doesn't know what he's doing. Here, these people are being somech on their rabbanim that heter mechira is okay. So shogeg works, so it's sfek svika that works. Or Betzina Bashol says, but it's a sfek svika that extracts money. You're trying to take money out of the Jew. You're trying to sell his land. And he brings that, although there's also a sfek svika that would allow the isra of shmita, but it's all dependent on the mammon. So Betzina Bashol says, since the minhag is that sfek svika cannot be motzi mammon, so over here, this sfek svika doesn't help. Just giving you an example of the dynamics where a minhag, how how strong it is, how it could play out. You have to know what Rav Avad Yosef to answer to that, but that's a fascinating discussion. So then there's other minhagim. There's a third category of minhage bet HaKnesset, minhage HaKehila, which the Kahal says Brich Shemeh in a Farsi translation, for example. Have you seen that, by the way? Yeah. In our synagogue, they did that. They translated Brich Shemeh in Farsi. And there's all types of beautiful minhagim, which are important to keep, but they don't have the same halachic strength as the other two topics. So whenever you talk about minhag, those are minhag, you have to know, you have to be a Talmid Chacham and know when it applies and how it applies. So one of the important discussions in minhag, in that second category that I spoke about, that a minhag is basically how to decide halacha. There was a very heated debate between the Ma'arik and the Peri Chadash. The Ma'arik lived in the 1500s, and he wrote about a certain minhag that people used to dance on Simchat Torah. And dancing on Simchat Torah you're not allowed to dance on Yom Tov and on Shabbat. It's in the Gemara and Betzah that you might come to make instruments. But they danced on Simchat Torah, and they also would call for the aliyot people, even though there was Kohanim in the Bet Midrash, and that seemed to fly in the face of halacha to do those things. So the Ma'arik brought down, the Bet Yosef speaks about the Ma'arik, one of the great poskim, Rav Yosef Kolon, writes a very famous teshuvah, and he says, a minhag could be mevatel halacha. There are some times where a minhag is so strong that it could nullify the halacha. And the Peri Chadash was one of the great Sephardic Geonim, Rav Chizkiah de Selua. He was very sharp, and he didn't, if he felt he was right, he argued against some of the greatest Gedolim. And the Peri Chadash, in Siman Tav Tzadivav, in Dinei Minhagi Yisur Veheter Ot Yud, right, I don't know what the Ma'arik is saying. The Ma'arik says he's based on a Gemara Masechet Menachot Daf Lamed Bet that says that if Eliyahu Hanavi would come and tell us we don't do chalitza with a sandal, says that you have to do chalitza with a shoe, not with a sandal. But if Eliyahu Hanavi says don't do it with a sandal, we don't listen to him, because the minhag is already to do chalitza with a sandal. So the Ma'arik says, you see that we follow minhag. And the Pri Chadash says, first of all, we don't paskin like that Gemara. I have other Gemarot that we're not posek that way. And he says, how could you say that a minhag that goes against halacha would you would be mevatel? So this machloket of the Pri Chadash and the Ma'arik, there are those who make a very, very large machloket out of it, a very big discussion out of it. It's actually talking about a very specific case where the posek at hand that is examining the sugya feels that the minhag doesn't have what to rely on. It's a derabanan. So since it's a derabanan, what's better? Is it better to keep the minhag and not confuse the people, not be mutzilaz on the people, or say, no, yikuv adin etar, the halacha is not that way. What do I care what people are? Do we have to educate them? That's where there's a machloket Ma'arik and Pri Chadash, and the Magen Avram says we follow the Ma'arik, and the Chatam Sofer says we follow the Pri Chadash. It's a very big machloket. But what happens when you have a minhag, and this is much more common, where you take a look at the general scope of the sugya, and there is what to rely on. There are strong poskim that follow certain opinions, and there are other poskim that say, no, it's a problem. We hold it's a minhag isur. That's going to be already a discussion. And the Pri Chadash himself, I recently discovered this after I learned the Pri Chadash for many years. I never noticed that he said this. And the Pri Chadash himself says like this, Umilta de pshita, it's obvious. The Af Rav, who said that we follow minhag, lo amra, he only said erechada ve'plukta v'nit pasheta minhag echad minayo. He's only saying when there's a machloket and the common custom became like one of the sides. Ve'afilu svarat yachid neged rabim. And even if it's the minority against the majority, this is the Pri Chadash talking. Velehachi, and therefore, by the chalitzat sandal, that case in Menachot, kivan she'alacha tikuahi, it was a very strong based, rooted halacha, shenaguam besandal, afim yavo liyav yomar epech mizeh, even if Eliyahu Hanavi is going to come say, no, the halacha is not that way, and he's like Svarat Rabim, and he's like the majority. Eliyahu Hanavi is like the majority, imagine. En shomin lo. We don't listen to him. So the Pri Chadash is saying, when you have a minority opinion that the custom became like him, that's what you follow. But something that's clear, that's in Isur de Rabbanan, we hit with a copper hammer anybody who doesn't want to listen. What do you mean? You're going to follow the minhag? It's against halachah. And the Marik says, no, we still would follow the minhag in such a case. But in a case where it's a minority opinion and it's a valid minority opinion, the Pri Chadash says, of course you have to follow the minhag. And this throughout the generations, you'll see the poskim, they struggle with this klal. They struggle with this rule. For example, the Rav Chaim Palaji writes in his Shelot Utshuvot Lev Chaim that there was a minhag to answer Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo on all brachot, even brachot that you are being Yotzei Yedei by Kiddush. That was the minhag in Morocco. That was the minhag in Syria. That was the minhag in Turkey. The Hatam Sofer had this minhag. There was many communities in Jerba and in Tunisia. A lot of places they had this minhag. I don't know exactly if they spoke about it in the Sefer what the Persian minhag was, but it was an old minhag that Baruch Hu was answered on all brachot. I'm not going to get into the subject now and the different proofs to it, but the Lev Chaim writes regarding Arinyan. He says, even though I say that any minhag that I think is wrong, we have to nullify it, but a minhag like Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo, it's a very strong minhag. I remember my own grandfather growing up, who is the great Rav Yosef Birkei Yosef, which I believe is the Chikrei Lev, one of the greatest Sephardic Acharonim ever. They called him the Shagat Aryev, the Sfaradim. Sorry. He himself always answered Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo. So a minhag like that, of course we keep. It's an example of a strong minhag. Is even if it's the majority would say not that way, you would keep that minhag. And it's confusing because you'll see some poskim say, I think we should get rid of this minhag. Other poskim say, not. Whenever they say they want to get rid of the minhag, it would seem to be because they understand that minhag has nothing what to rely on. But if the minhag has what to rely on, that's the strength of minhag. So with that introduction, I want to give you I want to give you in the next 15 minutes a perspective of the certain minhagim, and I'm going to speak about it more in the next shiur in the yeshiva of different minhagim that there was in Paras that had what to rely on. So this is our Talmidei Chachamim that made the research, and they had what to rely on. So I'll start with the simple minhag. When the tzibur goes to the Torah, you call somebody that goes up to the Torah. So after they finish the kriya, before they start the bracha, what do they say? What's the comment that they say? Emet Toratenu HaKedosha. Emet Toratenu HaKedosha. This was a minhag that was also done in Turkey. It was a minhag done in Morocco. It was a minhag done in many places. Now, halachically, there's no issue with that because there is no hefsek once you finish the Torah. There were some people that gave a drasha for tzedakah collecting money before they did the bracha charuna. And the Ben Ish Chai in Raf Pe'alim Chelek Gimel Orachem Siman Men Bet, he was miyashev the minhag that this was the minhag of Baghdad, that in other places that the Hatan Bereshit Simchat Torah would say even the Simanat Tova before he started Kriyat Torah, the first bracha. So all the more so the last bracha. And Rav Ovadia Yosef in Yabi Omer Chelek Alev Orach Chaim Siman Tet and Chazon Ovadia Chot Shabbat Chelek Bet Amud Ayin Resh says also there's no problem of second the minhag of Emet Toratenu Kedusha. He said it's a tova, maybe somebody should stay away. That's somebody who doesn't have a minhag. Somebody who has a minhag, there is strong opinions what to rely on. And this is what you're going to say. So why should I get into it in the first place? Why should I keep it? This is something that is a very important question. And I think that I'm going to address it at the end. Remind me to address it at the end. Why should I get into it in the first place? Because sometimes we're obligated according to halacha, and other times where there's also inyanim of keeping the tradition in line. Because number one, it circumvents certain halachic issues, and number two, it keeps a certain amount of yirat shamayim, and number three, it is something that is a zilzul to the previous generation. So that, for example, that's one minhag of Emet Toratenu Kedusha that the Persian community had. A lot more. I'm just skipping through. So that's why, if you look at the Shilot Utshuvot Yabia Omer, he discusses this at length, and he'll prove to you from many, many sources that there's no problem of zik. That there's no problem of vivsek between once the Kriyat Torah is finished and the thing. I mean, obviously you shouldn't stop in the middle and go get yourself a cup of coffee, but we're talking about that it's for being mechazik the Torah and a person being me'amet the Torah by him and a person. I'll give you an example. Our minhag in the Moroccan communities, when Aseret Dibrot was read, everyone would stand up and they would put their talit on their head and it would be totally quiet, and it was like mamash kabbalat Torah. There's others that came and they questioned the minhag. They said in the Shulot Teshuvat Rambam says not to do it, but even after Rambam said not to do it, the communities for generations still kept it. So there are communities that came to say you're not supposed to stand up during Kriyat Torah. So you have a question: to stand or not to stand? Chidah says you could stand. Others say you shouldn't. So I was faced with the question: so should we or should we not? So it's very simple to say, well, I'll be machmir like the other opinions. But you know what you would lose out from there? You would lose out that tremendous amount of yirat shamayim and chizuk that everybody got during Aseret Dibrot. You know, I remember they used to talk like crazy in the Bet HaKnesset. I'm not going to say which one. People would talk. When it came to Aseret, all of a sudden everybody was quiet. They put a talit on their head. You could feel a pin drop. How do I know that whatever I'm worth today was because of these type of minhagim that infused with me a tremendous amount of yirat shamayim, tremendous amount of fear of Hashem, tremendous amount of awe, and it gave me a lot of chizuk. You don't know what the calculations are. So these are calculations for great people. But as we saw, when something has what to rely on, Rav Chaim Palaji says, we don't nullify it if it has what to rely on. What has what to rely on or not, you have to look in the Sfarim of the Poskim. And that's why they do a tremendous job over here quoting it, the two Chachamim that wrote this this section of Minhagim. So, okay, let's speak about, so since Rabbi Javari brought bracha on Rosh Chodesh, and he's the Mara Da'atra of this Bet Midrash over here, you have to understand, Rabbi Javari is not so simple. Javari pretends that he's very, unassuming. But he's mamash a gaon. He knows a tremendous amount, and he learns a tremendous amount, and he loves the community here, and he just gives it his all. So you have to have tremendous respect for what you have over here. You have to appreciate who you have. When I have questions, I ask him. He's very, very special Talmid Chacham. So that's about Rabbi Javari. Now he asked me a question. What about bracha Rosh Chodesh? I asked some of the old Persian Rabbanim, and they all say that they made a bracha on Halal Rosh Chodesh. Actually, I was upstairs. I saw the Sidur Tfilat Bnei Tzion. It was used in Paras, because over there it says to make a bracha on Likro et Halel on Rosh Chodesh. And that doesn't surprise me at all, because the Bet Yosef writes in Siman Taf Chaf Chet that was the minhag. That was the minhag in Sfarad, the Sephardic minhag, the Ran and the Magid Mishneh, both right. That was the minhag, and it's based on the opinion of the Rif, Rav Yitzchak Alfasi, that when you're betzibur, you make a bracha, not beyachid. Yachid Ashkenazi make a bracha, even if they're praying to the kotel. That means their own kotel in their house. They don't go to minyan. They even make a bracha privately. But by Sfaradim, when they're betzibur, the Rambam says you don't make a bracha on a minhag. But in Eretz Yisrael, that's what many of the Edut HaMizrach, they don't make a bracha on Halel in Rosh Chodesh. Other communities do. I'm not getting into that. But in Chutz La'aretz, communities that make a bracha on Halal, of course, continue. Now, the Persian community doesn't nowadays. I asked Rabbi Zargari, why don't you, Rabbi Zargari from Los Angeles, he says, you're right, if I had the guts, I would do it, if I had the strength. Now, he didn't say it in that language. He agreed that he remembers that's how his father did. It's very hard to change something that changed. I don't know why it changed, when it changed, how it changed. Remember Rav Ovadia Yosef, when he visited France, and there they made a bracha on Halal, he encouraged it. He says, and I'm talking about Eretz Yisrael, not to make a bracha, not on Chutz La'aretz. And Chutz La'aretz is where, so I don't really know why it changed, and what's the basis not to say bracha, but that's the Rabbanim of the community to decide whether they should make a switcheroo like that. Once the minhag changed, to bring it back, I don't know. These are questions that are beyond my scope, and I wasn't paid to give these things. I wasn't paid at all. But I'm just saying. So.
Here is, I think, like where the question becomes for a lot of us is, let's say so we inherited certain minhagim that we remember in our homes, in our families, parents, grandparents, the older generation. But amongst the older generation, there weren't Talmidei Chachamim per se. But
that is exactly the subject. So that's it. They were Talmidei Chacham. So this is why. Oh, what's your name?
Moshe Aziz.
Hi, Rabbi Moshe Aziz. Let me answer the question. Let me answer the question. This is an excellent question. It says they weren't Talmidei Chacham. This is the flack that I got as well. That like who says that they knew what they were doing? So in Morocco there was many Talmidei Chachamim, and in Persia I agree there was less. But what the phenomenal research that I'm going to present in a few moments is that you'll see that every one of those minhagim wasn't an aberration. If you would see after a while, everything has to be researched. Every subject has to be researched, right? If you would notice a pattern that one minhag after the other was not only minhag paras, it was also the minhag in Iraq, which the Kaf HaChaim says the minhag paras are influenced a lot from Iraq, because that's where they learned, and a lot of the rabbinim came from there. And you notice that was the minhag in Turkey. And you notice that was the minhag in Algeria, and in Morocco, and in most Sephardic countries. So you say, hey, it probably wasn't an aberration. Right now that you mentioned it, I'm going to discuss buying clothing, not buying clothing during Sfirat HaOmer. My minhag is we buy new things during Sfirat HaOmer. I'm not machmir on that. But when a Persian is going to ask me, I tell him definitely to machmir. You're going to say, so where did it come from? There's nowhere in Shulchan Aruch that it says you can't buy clothing. It doesn't even say that you can't say Shechianu. So what's the problem? And you're right, somebody could forcefully come and say there's no such minhag, it's a ta'ut, it's an aberration, and it's just people who didn't know what they were doing, and it's superstition, and that's it. By the way, a lot of things are superstition, you should be careful. Root out superstition. But was this superstition or not? So let me tell you, the Geonim already, this is brought down in the Shilot Uchivot of Rav Shraya Gaon. Where did he live, by the way? In the area of Paras, in that whole area. The Geonim, this is before the Rishonim. Teshuvat, done in the Sefer Teshuvat Chachmei Ashkenaz V'Tzavrat Siman Samech Tet, Gazru Chachamim shelo la'asot simcha ben Pesach v'Latzer v'shelo la'asot ksut chadasha ad Shavuot, and not to do a new beged until Shavuot. Until Shavuot even. So, not only that, there's a Sefer HaTadir of Moshe ben Yekutiel from Chachmei Italia that says we're careful not to wear begadim chadashim until Lag BaOmer. And then there's a Sefer Minhag Tov from one of the Rishonim from Italia that writes Sefer Leket Yosher from the Rav of the Trumat HaDeshen. We're talking about the 1400s. Also, these are halachas that we have to ask. But I'm just telling you the makor. A beged chadash from Lag BaOmer we don't wear. The Achronim also, right, this was the minhag in Frankfurt. This was the minhag in Vermazia. This was the minhag in Jerba in Tunis. This was the minhag of the Pachad Yitzchak from Italy. This is the minhag of some places in Morocco held this. Torat Yekutiel, Horot Natan, Yalkut Avraham, Orchot Yosher. On and on and on. So there is a source to this minhag. So you're going to come and tell me a minhag that has no source, you could be mevatel. This doesn't sound like a minhag that has no source. This sounds like a minhag leachmir that people kept upon themselves. Now, if I saw that it was like the minhag was to scratch their head and turn around 5 times, and we should do that also. If there's no makor, really, it probably we should be mevatel that minhag. And by the way, a lot of my original Sefer Magen Avot was rooting out any minhag that wasn't appropriate, that was against the halachah, and saying that's not a minhag. But the minhagim that are left over here that these Talmidei Chachamim did, you will search their knowledge yourselves, and they will tell you that these were minhagim that had a pattern and had what to rely on. I'm not going to have enough time to speak about the controversial subject of when to make a bracha on hadlakat nerot, when women make a bracha on hadlakat nerot. I actually had a discussion with this with Rabbi Daniel Shliach Tzibur Shlita, one of the rabbanim of the communities, and he was very passionate about it as well. He was saying that the perspective is the following, and this is the question by Hadlakat Nerot Shabbat. It is clear that the Sephardic communities, as well as the Ashkenazi communities, and I'm just going to mention some of the Sephardic communities, the Sefer Chesed La'ala, in the Zahaskama to this kuntras from Rav Yaakov Chaim Sofer. He says, the minhag of the Sfaradim of Algeria, of Amsterdam, Afghanistan, Baghdad, Bukharia, Gibraltar, Jerba, Gruzia, Damascus, Hodu, Turkey, Kurdistan, Lub, Morocco, Mitzrayim, Portuguese, Paras, and Tunis, was that the women would make a bracha after they lit. After they lit. The Ma'amar Mordechai, the Gidulat Elisha, and others were emphatic that the opinion of Maran is to make the bracha before and after. This minhag that I mentioned was based on the Chida, on the Ben Ish Chai, and many, many other opinions that understood that if you make a bracha, you're mekabel Shabbat. It's a big machloket. But these chachamim understood that it's more of a problem to make a bracha and be mekabel Shabbat than the other way around. So that's how this minhag evolved throughout generations. So in our generation, we're zoche to have Hagan Rav Ovadia Yosef Zatzal, that was the mamash changed all of Yahadut Sfarad, and had was one of the greatest geonim in our times, and he emphatically said we have to change this minhag because Maran seems to imply that you make the bracha beforehand and not after. So this is a big question. You have a Gadol Ador, and he says, he writes in Chelik Tet, a Gadol Ador is the right to change a minhag, which is the next Pri Chadash afterwards, when he feels that there's a problem. So Rav Ovadia Yosef's perspective was that there was a she'elah of bracha levatala, and therefore he has the right as a Gadol to say that I want to change this to my community and to whoever else wants to listen. And many people listen to that. But the other side of the coin is that there are others saying, wait, this was our minhag for generations upon generations, and it has what to rely on. And as we learned, a minhag that was what to rely on, not only does what to rely on, there's very important reasons why it was done, because otherwise we're mikabel Shabbat. We're going to be mikabel Shabbat. We're going to be mikabel Shabbat once you make the bracha. And how you get light? So I gave a shiur about this recently in Harnof, actually right across the street from Rav Ovadia Yosef's house, and I spoke about this. And afterwards, somebody came to me. He said he was a rav in the yeshiva where I spoke, and he says, when I was a young boy, I used to go to listen to the shiurim of Rav Ovadia Yosef, and my father was a rebbe in Porat Yosef at the time. So I go back to my mother and I tell her, Mom, you're doing everything wrong. The way you're doing the bracha is like you're lighting and then you make the bracha, and it's totally wrong. So my father told me, wait, relax. Let's go together to Rav Ezra Atiyah. Ezra Atiyah was the Rosh Yeshiva Porat Yosef at the time. He was the Rav of Rav Yosef. He told them, listen, they're saying that my wife's doing wrong. My son is saying my wife's doing wrong. What should we do? Ezra Atiyah told them, keep on doing what you're doing and what your mother's doing. Don't ask questions. This is what we did. And he didn't go and explain to him the tons of opinions that say why you make a hadlaka and a bracha. So it's a big machloket. All I'm asking is that people research the subject and understand what the machloket is, and you follow your Rav. But the worst sickness is ignorance, because then you're just talking with not knowing what you're saying. That's not good. And this way you understand all opinions, and you're more prepared to understand how to follow. So that's because you mentioned like in the Shabbat. So Birkat Halel also, that was the custom, like the Rif, and that was the minhag of the Sfaradim, and there was a minhag in Persia, but it changed. So once a minhag changes, that becomes a little bit more complicated. A few more quick halachot, because I'm really running out of time, Rabotai, is getting married during the 3 weeks. Where did they never got married during the 3 weeks in Paras. Never. This was the minhag in Turkey, there's a minhag in Bavel, there's a minhag in Morocco, there's a minhag in Jerba, there's a minhag in Syria, there's a minhag in Teiman, there's a minhag in Libya, there's a minhag that the Chemed brings us down. So the Sefer Maim Chaim Rabbi Yosef Misas writes, this was the universal custom. Minhag kol ha'olam. So once again, you have something that is not random. It's not a minhag of turning around your head 5 times and saying, hey, it's a minhag that had what to rely on. So, if you don't have a minhag, I understand. And what does that mean you don't have a minhag? If you don't know what your minhag is, you're not obligated to look into it. Rabbi Yashiv told me this many times, that a minhag that you don't know what your minhag is, you could follow ikar adin. But if you know your community has a custom and it has a minhag, of course you should keep it. Cutting hair during Sfirat HaOmer. Same thing, at least from Rosh Chodesh people were machmir. In Paras. Gets a little bit more complicated now, but I'm not even going to speak about washing during the 9 days, because I don't think people are going to be able to follow that. No, it's difficult. What I tell people is that, no, because the minhag, and this is a point over here, we could be very lenient on the whole topic of the 3 weeks and the 9 days, but you have to admit it, that we lost some of that passion of Churban Bet HaMikdash that they had in the old country. We lost that. We were perfumed and we're fully showered a day before Tisha B'Av because there's no Shavuot Shechalbo. Yeah. They never did that in Paras. And in Morocco, they never did that. In other Sephardic countries, they were always machmir. Because for them, it was like, how can you do that? Like, the Churban Bet HaMikdash? They would cry. So I think, if you're going to ask Aniya Katan, that it's very hard for us nowadays because we're used to shower every day. So there's ways how to shower in a more permitted fashion, maybe with not freezing water, but a little warm water and washing off the dirt, not a full hot shower, a full hot bath. So there's ways how to navigate that. But the concept is that, this I'm getting back to my original point, is that it's very easy to say, forget about what they did then. They didn't know what they were doing. They were just randomly doing things, and I know more because I learn every day, and I come, and you're right. You knew more than your grandmother. You did. And you probably knew more than your grandfathers as well, a lot of you. Especially if you learned by Rabbi Javar, you probably know more. But I'm going to tell you something. Reb Shimshon Pinkus once told us, Zichrono Livracha, is that although he knew more than his grandmother, he doesn't think when he went to sleep, his grandmother took out the Sifrei Kabbalah and started learning. He doesn't think that happened. But she was much greater in Imunah than him. Because for her, Imunah was like this table. It was real. It was tangible. It wasn't a concept in the air. And the respect that we have to have for the previous generations in order to also keep the minhagim is, now that we see that the minhagim, it could be they were based from the Geonim. It could be. As we saw some of that pattern over here. It could be, I just told you a few of them. You could see the rest on your own. It could be it was based on the minhag of Iraq, of a lot of chachamim that learned in Iraq and came and brought those customs and decided that this should be the halachah. It could be it's minhagim that are very old, and if they have a source and they have what to rely on, in some cases it would be very difficult to say that you could deviate from the minhag. And in other cases, it's asur to do that. And in other cases, it's a concept of a good thing not to say, I'm ignoring what the past was. Why would you do that? An education to the children is always connecting the previous generations to this generation. If you're not, how are you going to know what happened? Maybe Har Sinai also didn't happen. Lo aleinu. Once you cut the connection. So one of the yesodot hadat is respect for the previous dorot and the previous generations that we give to our children and our grandchildren. So Yehi Ratzon that this topic of minhagim is something that is not something. It's a halachic topic that it's the bedrock of halacha. How we're posek halacha. It's the bedrock of a lot of our hanhagot, and it's something that we should be mindful in researching and keeping to bring us to more yirat shamayim, kavod chachamim, and always from a perspective of knowledge. Chazak u'baruch.